Imprisoned within the walls of the tower, the once brilliant Sir Walter Raleigh, a favorite of Queen Elizabeth, now languished, burdened by years of confinement and the specter of imminent death. His fate hung by a thread, and only a desperate, almost mad hope could save him from the gallows. In this despair, his mind once again turned to the alluring legends of the Golden City, of El Dorado, a myth that had once before led him to the shores of Guiana. Raleigh understood. Only the immense riches promised from the New World could melt the ice of King James I's distrust and grant him freedom. With each passing day, his resolve strengthened, and he took up his pen to lay before the monarch his last, boldest proposition. What he intended to describe was not merely a land, but the embodiment of an unattainable dream of limitless gold. In his letters, he spared no detail, painting for the monarch a picture of unprecedented wealth. He described a land where gold was not merely mined, but was a part of the daily lives of its inhabitants. There, he claimed, entire mountains gleamed with pure metal, and rivers carried golden sands in their waters, so abundant that this was not just a deposit, but a living legend, bolstered by testimonies that Raleigh skillfully interwoven with his own observations and long-standing rumors. Every word was meant to ignite the crown's avarice, to convince James I of the reality of these treasures, capable of changing England's destiny. However, behind this golden mirage lay another, no less crucial, strategic objective. The Spanish, despite decades of frantic searches and immense resources, had never managed to find this mythical country. Raleigh understood perfectly that every day of delay gave them a head start. Competitors, especially the Spanish crown, relentlessly scoured the continent, and only a miracle kept them from the coveted shores. This was not merely an expedition for gold, but a daring chess move on the global stage. To outmaneuver Spain, to deprive it of a source of inexhaustible wealth, to make England the undisputed hegemon. This was what Raleigh promised. He played on the monarch's deepest ambitions, offering not just treasures but geopolitical supremacy capable of redrawing the world map. Raleigh's pleas, skillfully woven from promises of golden mountains and geopolitical advantages, did not go unanswered. One cold morning, the heavy oak door of his cell in the bloody tower creaked open. Before him stood not the grim figures of executioners, but the stern faces of the tower governor and a high-ranking royal officer. The air, usually thick with the stale scent of despair, now crackled with an unexpected, almost electric anticipation. The state prisoner, whose fate had hung by a thread for many years, was led not to the block, but to a waiting carriage, gaining not freedom, but a reprieve, a curious second chance granted by the monarch, intrigued by the promise of mythical gold. For Sir Walter, this event marked a strange, incredible beginning to a new, perilous chapter that led him not to execution, but to the embrace of the boundless, untamed ocean. Under the gray, still cool spring sky of 1617, a small squadron slowly set forth from the mouth of the Thames. Only a few ships, but each carried not only supplies but also the unbearable weight of hopes and despair. Aboard the flagship, the Darlington, stood Sir Walter Raleigh, a man recently condemned to death, now commanding a royal expedition. The first days of sailing were marked not only by the roar of waves and the creak of masts, but also by Raleigh's profound awareness of the absurdity and uniqueness of his situation. He was free, but this freedom was a mere reprieve from execution, bargained for with the promise of legendary treasures. Every knot sailed brought him not only closer to the mysterious shores of Guiana, but also to the ultimate resolution of his destiny. In these days, as the horizon unfolded into a boundless expanse, his thoughts inevitably returned to those ancient maps and whispers that promised the way to the Golden City. In the cramped cabin of the flagship, Darlington, as the vessel battled the Atlantic waves, Sir Walter Raleigh pored over yellowed maps and tattered records. His fingers traced faded ink, and his gaze pierced the lines drawn decades ago. He tried to reconstruct from memory every legend, every rumor, every shred of information he had ever heard about El Dorado, from indigenous tales to port tavern gossip. For him, the Golden City was not merely a myth or a last chance for salvation. It was an unshakable truth, a goal worth risking everything for. His belief was absolute, almost fanatical, fueling hope for success against all odds. He was ready to lead his men into the unknown. Aboard the Darlington, and subsequently the entire small squadron, Sir Walter Raleigh proved himself a commander, whose will was unyielding and whose methods were severe, almost ruthless. His demands on his officers bordered on tyranny. Any delay or doubt was met not merely with anger, but with icy contempt. Towards the sailors, he was frankly cruel, sparing no one in his relentless pursuit of the goal, whether it was punishment for the slightest transgression or exhausting labor without respite. But this ruthlessness was merely a reflection of his attitude towards himself. Raleigh tormented himself with work, depriving himself of sleep and rest as if trying to snatch victory from fate itself. His obsession with El Dorado was so all-consuming that it eclipsed any human weakness, transforming the expedition into a desperate race against death. He was ready to sacrifice everything for the gold that promised him not only wealth, but most importantly, his life. This resolve, however, could not alter the relentless reality of the ocean. Barely had Raleigh's expedition left the familiar shores of England when it felt the first harbingers of impending misfortune. The Atlantic, it seemed, did not wish to release its victims. Furious headwinds and treacherous currents repeatedly drove the ships back, as if an unseen hand sought to bar their way to the coveted goal. Days dragged on, wearing down the crew, who already bore the burden of his harsh discipline. Tension grew with each passing moment. The murmurs grew louder, the sailors' faces darker with fatigue and the premonition of ill fortune. Sir Walter, it seemed, only redoubled his severity, attempting to overcome the resistance of the elements by sheer force of will. But fate, which had long played cat and mouse with him, merely smirked, preparing a new, far harsher trial at the entrance to uncharted waters. After months of grueling struggle with the Atlantic, Raleigh's fleet finally neared the fabled shores of Guiana, where, according to legend, the Golden City lay hidden. The goal was almost tangible. The majestic mouth of the Orinoco, the gateway to mythical El Dorado. But fate, or perhaps nature itself, had prepared for them the last, most brutal trial. As soon as the ships approached the delta, the heavens opened, unleashing a furious squall upon the squadron. Hurricane-force winds, like an enraged beast, descended upon the vessels, ripping sails to shreds, turning them into lifeless rags, and depriving the ships of their last chance to maneuver. Furious, mountain-sized waves crashed onto the decks, threatening to swallow everything in their path, while the uncontrollable ships were carried straight towards razor-sharp coastal rocks. In that moment, as hope for salvation faded, it became clear that it wasn't just the sails that were torn to shreds. When the fury of the elements finally receded, Raleigh's fleet appeared disfigured and battered. The furious waves, not yet calmed, mercilessly tossed the damaged ships onto shoals, where their keels scraped against the treacherous seabed. Masts, once proudly slicing the sky, now lay as broken splinters, and rigging, once taut, hung in tattered shreds, useless and doomed. The damage to the fleet was catastrophic. Every ship bore the scars of this battle with the ocean, casting doubt not only on the continuation of their journey, but also on the very possibility of survival. In these wreckage lay not only physical damage, but also a harbinger of growing despair among the crew. The catastrophic storm at the mouth of the Orinoco seemed only to intensify Raleigh's obsession. Instead of admitting defeat, he drove his exhausted men further into the uncharted waters. Each new attempt to advance up the river, each unsuccessful search for signs of gold, only amplified the murmuring. Damaged ships, depleted supplies, lost men, all this accumulated, transforming despair into a muffled, then open, discontent. The crew, once submissive, now looked at their commander with undisguised hostility. Tension hung heavy in the air, thick like a tropical mist, portending an inevitable explosion. The crew, pushed to their limits, was on the verge of mutiny, and even Raleigh's iron will could not ignore this deadly whisper. After months of grueling sailing, battling furious currents, tropical hurricanes, and the murmuring of an exhausted crew, the moment arrived when even Raleigh's iron will could no longer deny the obvious. The Golden City, the alluring mirage of El Dorado, never revealed itself to their eyes. Every meter ascended up the river, every bend only distanced them from reality, bringing them closer to complete ruin. With a heavy heart, Sir Walter gave the order to turn back. This was not merely a tactical retreat, but a bitter admission of defeat, the shattering of his last, most cherished hope. The dream of immense treasures, of saving his honor and his life, of restoring his former glory, all of it crumbled, leaving only the ashes of disappointment. However, even in this moment as the flagship Darlington turned back, Raleigh maintained an unshakable conviction in the existence of El Dorado. Just not here. Not by this route. The admission of defeat, the order to return he had given, did not signify an end to his faith. Quite the opposite. Even after the devastating hurricane and fruitless searches up the Orinoco, Raleigh remained unwavering in his conviction. El Dorado existed, and its location was precisely known to him. He was not an ordinary adventurer sailing blindly along the coast, hoping for a chance discovery. His strategy was determined not by blind luck, but by a firm, almost fanatical certainty in the coordinates of the Golden City. This knowledge, he believed, set him apart from all other seekers, giving him a unique advantage. That is why his expedition was not a wandering, but a purposeful movement towards a predetermined goal, which he pursued with the obsession characteristic only of true visionaries. His confidence rested on something more than rumors, on knowledge that he believed was his unique advantage. His unshakable belief in El Dorado was rooted not in blind hope, but in the conviction that he possessed unique knowledge. Raleigh had spent years piecing together fragments of information, ancient indigenous tales of the Golden City, passed down through generations, weathered Spanish maps filled with enigmatic markings, and most importantly, the results of his own meticulous explorations during previous expeditions to Guiana. It was this deep, almost personal understanding of the geography and legends that set him apart from the multitude of other treasure seekers. He felt that the secret of El Dorado not only existed, but that he, Walter Raleigh, was on the verge of unraveling it, separated only by a thin veil of fate. How close did he truly come to his golden dream? Were his maps and indigenous traditions merely echoes of long-vanished civilizations, intertwined with myths, or did they contain a grain of truth, elusive to others? This question continues to haunt historians. Raleigh's conviction in the reality of El Dorado, so unshakable, bordered on obsession, leading one to wonder, was he a visionary, nearly achieving the impossible, or was his unshakable belief merely a fatal illusion that led him to the gallows? Perhaps he saw in Guiana not just pristine jungles, but a harbinger of immense riches, distorting reality under the influence of his golden delusion. The myth of the Golden City, which fueled his ambitions, took on flesh and blood for him, becoming his sole purpose for existence. But what was the price of this relentless faith? The return from the Orinoco marked not merely another defeat, but the ultimate collapse of a grand dream for which Sir Walter had risked everything, including his already precarious life. This expedition, his last hope for redemption and the restoration of his former glory, only spiraled into a new cycle of despair. The gold that was meant to save him proved to be a phantom, alluring yet elusive. Instead of triumph, Raleigh brought back only bitter experience and empty holds. Fate, it seemed, inexorably led him to his destined end, tightening the noose around his neck with each new failure. A chance had been given but not seized, and the price for it was exorbitant. Now, with the royal treasury empty and his promises unfulfilled, an even darker shadow loomed over him. Returning from the depths of the Orinoco without gold was tantamount to a death sentence. Raleigh realized James would not forgive empty hands. The colossal expenses of the expedition, wages, provisions, ship repairs, demanded immediate compensation. Failure meant not only his demise but also the ruin of his patrons and a fall from grace in the eyes of the crown. The direct path to El Dorado was closed, but the need for wealth remained frantic. Time was running out. The specter of the tower loomed more distinctly. In this desperate situation, Raleigh feverishly sought an alternative solution capable of justifying his odyssey. He faced a choice that altered the very essence of his undertaking. Returning to the coast without the coveted gold, Raleigh faced a harsh reality. He had not only failed to fulfill the king's hopes, but had also incurred colossal losses. On the verge of complete ruin, this once brilliant courtier, now a desperate adventurer, made a fateful decision that forever changed the character of his expedition. If mythical El Dorado never revealed its treasures, then Spanish ships, laden with precious metals from the New World, presented a far more tangible and accessible target. Thus, the seeker of the legendary city, the dreamer and trailblazer, was forced to transform into something else, a privateer. His flagship, the Darlington, and the remnants of his flotilla, once destined for great discoveries, now became an instrument of audacious plunder. The search for gold in the earth's depths was replaced by hunting for it across the ocean, and this desperate measure was his only chance for salvation. The disappointment of unfulfilled golden dreams quickly gave way to the harsh reality of survival. Sir Walter, desperate after the failure with El Dorado, directed his ships toward Spanish trade routes. The Atlantic once again became a battlefield, but now the targets were not mythical cities, but real treasures. Raleigh's storm-battered squadron descended upon defenseless Spanish convoys. Galleons laden with silver and gold, returning from the New World, became their prey. Blood, cries, the clang of boarding cutlasses, this was what now filled their days. A significant portion of the plunder, though obtained through piracy, formally covered the colossal expenses of the expedition. For a brief moment, only a fleeting instant, the heavy shadow of royal wrath receded, giving way to the illusion of salvation. But this momentary respite was merely the calm before a far more destructive storm. The plunder seized by Raleigh during his privateering raid on the Spanish galleons indeed proved substantial. The gold and silver flooding into the English treasury, it seemed, should have appeased King James and justified all risks. However, this sudden financial windfall turned into a diplomatic catastrophe of unprecedented scale. Spain, whose trade routes and colonial possessions had been audaciously attacked again, was enraged. Count Gondomar, the Spanish ambassador in London, immediately demanded the harshest punishment for Raleigh from James Thirst, accusing him of piracy and violating the fragile peace between the nations. The royal court, gripped by anxiety, anticipated the monarch's inevitable wrath. For James, peace with Spain was a priority, and Raleigh, despite the treasures he brought, had jeopardized it. Now the king faced a choice between immediate gain and long-term state interests. A heavy silence fell upon the royal court. James III faced an agonizing choice that went far beyond personal whims. On one side lay Raleigh's newly acquired pile of Spanish gold, a tempting yet illicit trophy. On the other, the fragile peace with powerful Spain, so painstakingly achieved and so valuable for the stability of the English crown. Ambassador Gondomar minced no words, demanding immediate retribution against the audacious privateer. The monarch, whose policy was built on diplomacy rather than adventurism, understood perfectly. The immediate gain from questionable plunder could not outweigh long-term state interests. The welfare of the realm, its reputation, and most importantly, peaceful relations with continental powers, were paramount to him. The fate of a single man, even one as distinguished as Sir Walter, seemed insignificant in the face of such momentous decisions. Diplomatic pressure from Spain, personified by the relentless Count Gondomar, became unbearable. For James III, who prided himself on his peacemaking and sought alliances, especially with a power as mighty as Spain, Sir Walter Raleigh became not a symbol of wealth, but rather a liability. The king, weighing the scales, understood that peaceful coexistence with Madrid held far greater value than any treasures obtained through piracy. And so, after long deliberation, a decision was made that shook London. Sir Walter Raleigh would be executed. It was an act of appeasement, a sacrifice made on the altar of grand politics to extinguish the flames of Spanish wrath and preserve the fragile balance of European powers. The elimination of the offender, even one who brought wealth, seemed the only path to tranquility. However, behind this pragmatic decision lay another, more cynical logic. James's decision regarding Raleigh's fate was dictated not only by the urgent need to appease Spain. Behind the scenes of grand politics lay a cold, pragmatic calculation. For in the event of Sir Walter's execution, the question of returning the treasures he had acquired during his risky privateering raids became moot. The monarch, known for his shrewdness, always preferred to resolve state matters from a position of maximum advantage. Raleigh's execution not only eased tensions with Madrid, but also potentially freed the crown from financial obligations to the disgraced adventurer, allowing the plunder to remain in the treasury. Thus, the tragedy of one man translated into a multifaceted advantage for the king, where diplomacy and material gain intertwined into a single knot. However, to legitimize such a decision, other, more formal justifications were required. Upon his return to England, Raleigh discovered that the Spanish treasures he had brought back did not secure his freedom, but merely hastened his downfall. King James Thirsty, caught between Scylla and Charybdis, the wrath of Spanish ambassador Gondomar, and the need to preserve peace, made his decision. But executing a celebrated captain for piracy would have been too straightforward and could undermine the crown's authority. Instead, James chose the path of legal casuistry. Old, dusty charges of treason, dating back to the so-called main plot of 1603, were resurrected. The sentence, passed then and merely suspended, was now reactivated. The law became not an instrument of justice, but a flexible tool of political will, allowing him to dispose of an inconvenient figure without acknowledging his own errors or improper actions. Thus, Raleigh's fate was sealed not by new crimes, but by old sins, conveniently retrieved from the archives. When James III asserted his will, and the shadow of the old accusations seemed to materialize once more over Sir Walter's head, an unbearable silence settled around him. Those who had once admired his courage, shared feasts and intrigues with him, now hastily retreated into the shadows. Fear of royal disfavor proved stronger than any past friendship or loyalty. One by one, former associates, once beholden to Raleigh for their positions, turned away, saving their own skins from the approaching storm. He, once a brilliant favorite and audacious adventurer, found himself in complete isolation, abandoned by all who might have offered a helping hand. Now, with his fate once again hanging by a thread, he faced the sentence he had heard once before. Again, like an ominous echo, the shadow of the gallows loomed over Sir Walter Raleigh. The man whose life had been a succession of incredible rises and devastating falls, who had once escaped death's grasp for the phantom gold of Dorado, now stood once more at the precipice of oblivion. This was not merely a repetition of old treason charges. It was a stunning, bitter déjà vu, a return to the nightmare of 1603, but this time without the slightest hope of royal pardon or a new desperate adventure capable of delaying the inevitable. Fate, it seemed, had closed its tragic circle, returning him to the starting point, but with a far more crushing burden of defeat and personal sorrow that had broken his will even before the sentence was carried out. But behind all these geopolitical calculations, behind the Game of Thrones and the king's momentous decisions, lay a deeply personal tragedy. Sir Walter Raleigh, already broken by years of imprisonment, was utterly crushed by the death of his son, Walter Jr., who fell in battle at Santo Tomé. This blow was the last in a series of unimaginable losses that accompanied his odyssey. His entire life was a kaleidoscope of incredible rises and devastating falls, audacious hopes and bitter disappointments. From Queen Elizabeth's favorite to a Tower prisoner, from a dreamer of El Dorado to a privateer, and now, once again condemned to the gallows. It seemed as though fate itself had destined him for an endless cycle of trials, each new one merely a variation on the theme of past defeats. This sentence was not just a legal act, but the culmination of an exhausting struggle that had stripped him of everything but his own worn-out will. When news of the reinstated sentence reached Raleigh within the Tower walls, many expected to see rage or despair. But instead of a storm of emotions, the old mariner's face revealed only deep weariness and astonishing serenity. Years of confinement, the cruelty of fate, the death of his beloved son, all of it, it seemed, had extinguished the last sparks of his former fervor. He accepted the news of his imminent demise without much emotion, as if he had long resigned himself to this outcome. It was not fear, but rather exhaustion from endless struggle, from constant defiance against the blows of fate. Sir Walter, once a symbol of English greatness and an indomitable spirit, now stood before death like a philosopher who had exhausted all arguments. His stoicism was not for show, but deeply internal, steeped in the bitterness of years lived. In this silent acceptance of his own end lay perhaps a greater drama than in his fiercest battles. And yet, even in these final moments, fate had one more unexpected twist. In his final days, as the shadow of the gallows had already deepened over him, Sir Walter Raleigh was informed of the king's greatest mercy. The sentence, originally prescribing the horrific execution for treason, drawing, hanging, disemboweling, and quartering, a ritual designed not merely to kill but to erase a person from memory, was commuted. James I, perhaps out of residual respect for Elizabeth's once great favorite, or purely for pragmatic reasons, wishing to avoid excessive martyrdom that might elevate Raleigh in the public's eyes, decreed Raleigh would merely be beheaded. This was a paradoxical mercy that maintained outward propriety, but did not negate the inevitability of the end. And so, standing before his fate, he prepared for the final act of the drama that unfolded in the square. The morning of October 29, 1618, in Westminster, was marked by an ominous silence, portending a tragic end. On the scaffold, towering over the crowd, stood Sir Walter Raleigh. Not a broken old man, but one whose spirit remained unyielding to the very end. His gaze, accustomed to open seas and the gleam of blades, now rested on another metal, the dull gleam of the executioner's axe. The instrument of death, it seemed, was the only thing separating him from oblivion, from all earthly anxieties and unfulfilled hopes. Around him, in tense anticipation, the crowd stood frozen, absorbing every moment of this final scene. No trace of fear or despair clouded his face. Only a weary wisdom, an acceptance of the inevitable, as if he had long reconciled himself to his fate, with all its rises and falls. In that moment, as the world seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the final blow, Raleigh, a man of words and sharp intellect, prepared to utter his final, most weighty phrases that would forever enter history. On the scaffold, facing inexorable fate and the gaze of the crowd, Raleigh spoke his last words, full of striking serenity and bitter irony. "This is a sharp medicine," he declared, "but it is a physician for all diseases." In that phrase, uttered without a trace of fear, the full depth of his character was revealed. An indomitable mind, an unbroken will, and remarkable wit even on the brink of oblivion. For him, death was not an end, but a radical cure for all the ills of earthly life, from betrayals, from losses, from the endless intrigues of the court, from the burden of political games. It was his last, most radical way to find the freedom and peace he had so long been denied. Having concluded his thought, he prepared for his final act. On the morning of October 29th, 1618, on Westminster Square, beneath the gaze of a silent crowd, the final chapter of Sir Walter Raleigh's life unfolded. With dignity, unflinching, he laid his head upon the block, uttering his last bitter words. And then,